Hello, everyone. Welcome to Mental Health TV. We're really pleased to see you today. It's not our normal night, obviously Tuesday. So first of all, let me introduce you to some of my favourite people, actually. I'm sure that you'll enjoy hanging out with us as much as I like them. So first of all, I'll start with my lovely colleague, Vanessa.
Hello, everybody. Vanessa Garrity, mental health nurse, like Nicky. And I'd be co-presenting with Nicky, but also covering the social media. So we'd love it if you got involved in tonight's conversation. You can get involved either on Twitter by following MHTV hashtag. Any questions you've got, we'll try and feed into the discussion. Or you can join us on Facebook Live by liking the Unite MHNA page and commenting on the live thread.
Oh, brilliant. So tonight we're going to be talking about LGBTIQ plus issues and mental wellbeing and celebrating Pride Month. So can I introduce you to my lovely colleague, Sarah?
Hello, I'm Sarah Carr, and I suppose I'm a service user survivor researcher and an academic, and I work at the University of Birmingham.
There's lots of different things at once. I love that. We're getting real good value.
Yeah.
And Alfonso?
Hi everybody, I'm Alfonso Pezzella and I'm a lecturer at Middlesex University.
Yeah, and a researcher as well. Absolutely. So I think maybe let's start off by thinking about Pride Month. So it's hashtag still we, and it's a hashtag intended to sort of evoke that sense of resistance, resilience and unity. And I wondered if we could just pop around the panel and find out what Pride means to you. Sarah?
Okay, I suppose Pride, what it means to me is the opposite of shame, because LGBTQI plus communities have felt shame. People still do feel shame. And when Pride first originated, I think it must have been in the 70s, people were saying we're proud of ourselves, and they were taking quite a risk at coming out onto the streets, literally. And in my old age, I even remember a Pride where people were shouting at us, and that wasn't that long ago. So I think Pride is an important feeling that people should have. I now have ambivalent feelings towards the parade and the festival, which of course isn't going on this year, because I think it's become quite commercialised from when I were a lass. But I know it's still very, very valuable for people.
Yeah, absolutely. How about you, Alfonso? What's your take on it?
I do agree with Sarah, and I think Pride is a way to be all together, really, and to celebrate that we're here and we exist and that there is some kind of diversity. And it's also a way to celebrate all the successes that the LGBT community has made over the years. And to me, it's also a way to remember those who have achieved those rights for LGBT people over the years. But at the same time, Pride is also a way to say there's still a long way to go and there's still quite a lot that needs to be done in terms of the LGBT community. Also, what I would like to say is that Pride, particularly to me, I'm obviously a gay man and I was not out until a few years ago, probably maybe about 7 or 8 years ago. And Pride was a way to see people that they were there, so that I knew I was not alone. That I knew there were other people like me and they were there if I needed to. So that's what I think Pride is about. It's kind of like a voice to tell people, LGBT plus people, say, we're here and you're not alone in this.
Absolutely. Vanessa, did you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I think just to reflect on what everybody said, really. And for me, I like the celebratory element. I like that Pride, for me, I've got 2 children, so it's a way of starting a conversation with them, and it's a way of starting a conversation with everybody. And I know we've talked about some of the negative aspects in terms of the festival, that it's not a one-size-fits-all approach. Not everybody wants to get involved in a Pride festival. But, I have taken my children along to them, for example, and it's been really good. It's been a good opportunity for them to ask questions and to just have much more like inclusive values, which I think the next generation have anyway, naturally. Being a parent, I've noticed, huge changes. My children don't really distinguish as far as sexuality is concerned, and as far as thinking about, boys or girls at school and who their preferences are. It just seems, very natural to them now. But yeah, so I would say I like the celebratory element, and I like the fact that it brings everybody together.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? So there's loads of stuff come up already in just this discussion, isn't there, about the kind of history and how fast that history is changing, and in some ways how fast that history is moving on, so that some younger generations maybe don't necessarily know all the stuff that's gone on before.
Yeah,
I think what I take from it is that resistance. And also I think for our conversation tonight, we just want to be really clear right from the outset, is to have a lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender identity is not linked to being mentally ill. Those things are separate things that don't cause each other, like stigma and appalling behavior. And those are the things that we're talking about. We're actually looking at this as an identity, as a celebration and a way of being well. And it's only, 20 odd years since it was taken off of definitions and symptomology for having a mental health issue. So I think it's really important that we say there is this overlapping links, and we'll be talking about some of those links later on, but also saying, this is an opportunity to celebrate and to learn from each other as well, I think. Can I come around the different panel members and talk a little bit about some of the research that you guys have been doing, some of the sort of research and learning and teaching? So can I come to Sarah first?
Sure. I mean, one of the things that I've done most recently is with Helen Spandler from UCLan, University of Central Lancashire, is some work looking through the archives about how lesbian, same-sex attracted women, lesbian, bisexual women were treated in the psychiatric system because of their sexual orientation. So sort of reflecting back on what Alfonso was saying about pride, just thinking about the people who've gone before us. So yeah, it was an incredibly interesting and quite moving piece of research, because I experienced some sort of reparative therapy that I didn't actually ask for from a therapist who I went to because I had mental health problems, and he decided, well, your mental health problem is your sexual orientation, so let's look at that. So that was a personal kind of motivation for looking at this. So I had a kind of personal connection to the women who I found in the archives and their stories. There weren't that many things that we found, but what we did find was very powerful and scattered through the archives. And we were able to piece together some history around women's experiences, which are less documented than men's, because of course, male homosexuality was criminalised, and there is a kind of paper trail, particularly through the criminal justice system, where men were given either the option of psychiatric treatment or to prison. So there's a lot of documentation about that, but less about women who might have gone through the system. Although the period we were looking at, which was from 1950 to 1990, like you were saying, homosexuality, men and women, was to a greater or lesser extent classified as a mental illness or disorder.
Absolutely. Alfonso, what have you been researching? What have you been up to in terms of your work?
One of my biggest interests really is about the experience of coming out. So I've done some research in the past around coming out in the workplace, for example. But more recently, I've got interested in doing LGBT teaching research and see how LGBT issues should be implemented into the nursing curriculum, for example. And just on what Sarah has said, how the NHS workforce, for example, or healthcare professionals don't always know how to treat LGBT people, and they don't always understand their needs. So one of my research at the moment is an EU project that I'm doing with 6 other countries across Europe. And we're looking at how to develop a culturally competent and compassionate LGBT inclusive education. And we're looking at this from a cultural competence point of view as well, because in those countries who are partners in my project, LGBT is not even allowed to talk about. So, for example, we have Italy, and we have places like in Romania, where these issues are not even covered in any of the curriculum, not even in their personal lives. So it's very important that we build on to this knowledge and make sure that there is a more uniform EU model almost to teach LGBT issues to the future workforce.
It's interesting if you look at what Sarah was looking at to what you're looking at. It's such a short space of time that we've come from considering this to be an illness and considering actually not attending to this part of people's lives as something that's going to make people ill. You know, it's a huge, huge jump. And I think in some ways we're getting it much better, much better, and we're dealing with it much better. But in other ways, there still seems quite a lot of uneven practice around how we're managing this stuff. Did you look at LGBT in care homes as well? Were you on that project?
I wasn't on the project myself, but I was working closely with a colleague who was working on this project in care homes. And we did also another side project called Being Me, led by Professor Trish Hafford-Letchfield. And we looked at coming out for older people, for example, and the needs of older people as well.
Because I think that ties into a little bit with what Sarah was saying as well, in that if you've got people who have had that experience of being really appallingly treated and stigmatized, and then coming out and then finally getting to a stage where maybe they're using care home facilities or they're needing extra support at home, and all of a sudden they're being given care by people whose personal faith experiences or just lack of knowledge means that they just are not thinking. So, I mean, it's bad enough that people don't consider older adults' sexuality or sexual needs or just sexual sense of self. But how I worry a lot that people are, pretending that, their long-term partner is their sister or their friend or their brother, and they're so shameful. And it's shameful on us for not getting it right and not having, conversations that are sensitive and thoughtful. I think, Vanessa, did you have some questions coming through on social media?
Yeah. Just a moment. It's just a comment from Rebecca Bevington on Facebook, and she said, love how all your definitions of pride are really different, but all totally important aspects of it. For me, pride means being seen. I suppose that links into all of your different perspectives. So any thoughts on that? It's a lovely comment, isn't it?
I think you've got to have that plurality, haven't you? You've got to allow people to experience their life the way that they do. And a lot of the problems that we encounter are from people deciding for other people who they are or what they need. And that's bizarre. It's a bizarre thing to do. It's not healthy. So thinking about some of the research and some of the teaching that Sarah and Alfonso have been doing, is there anything we can sort of learn from that in terms of our own practice, in terms of if you have to give advice for practitioners in any settings, what things can they do to actually be helpful, to be supportive?
Do you want me to start?
No, Alfonso, go for it, yeah.
I mean, when we talk about health and social care practitioners or educators, I mean, I'm sure that they all want to do the best for their service users. And we, as educators, we teach them to do the best. We teach all about dignity and respect and compassion, and we build that into them. But when it comes to LGBT needs and issues, we don't actually do enough for this. We don't actually do enough in terms of making our own curriculum more inclusive and having more LGBT role models, for examples. But also, we don't actually teach anything like inclusive language. As you said, Nikki, if you see, for example, a trans person and you're not quite sure, maybe you will call them he or she, and that can be very upsetting for a person. At the same time, if you see two male couple together, like me and my partner, for example, we've been called brothers, cousins, everything apart from actual couple, and saying you are boyfriends or fiance. So it's very important to teach this to our own students, for example, and to teach more inclusive language, what language they should be using. So that's one start, for example, but it's also about role modeling. So it's about sharing the experiences with our students and show them that LGBT people are very much present in the society. And this is a word that I hate, but it's normal. It's normal to be gay. And it is the normality, so students should just learn and accept it in a way. I don't know if Sarah wants to add anything else onto that.
No, I think they're all very, very good points. And just thinking back to my research and the theme of resistance, I think it's important, if we're thinking about mental health care and support, to see that in the historical context. So, research shows that psychiatric treatment of LGBT people that happened decades ago, there's a problematic legacy there for mental health services today. And it's very important to understand how that legacy might play out in current practice. So, like you were saying, there's kind of an unevenness in people's experiences. I remember doing some work years ago on mental health and social care and LGBT people's experiences of it, and trying to educate social care workers about some of the issues you were talking about, Alfonso. And we wrote a paper, myself and a colleague, called "It Shouldn't Be Down to Luck." And I think it still is quite down to luck who you encounter in the health or social care context. And I think you're saying training and education is incredibly important for addressing that issue of luck, whether or not you get somebody who is accepting and supportive, or somebody who thinks you're in some way unwell or inferior just because of who you love or what your gender identity is.
I think it's really important as well. Oh, go on. What were you going to say, Vanessa?
I was just reflecting on the Black Lives Matters, really, and the sort of similarities around white privilege as well, that people will say that they're not homophobic and they're not discriminatory, but a lot of it is structural, isn't it? And if like a white person speaking from a white person's perspective will never really understand what it's been like to experience racism simply because of the colour of your skin. And it's a similar thing, and kind of like we talked about, student nurses, for example, might be, if they've never experienced any prejudice, they might not think it's an issue, and in some ways that can invalidate your experiences even more. So I think it's being aware that we're not just talking about people who have been, really overtly discriminatory, abusive, homophobic, but actually people having that empathy and looking at sort of the structural systems and where they can communicate. And the other thing for me is the whole echo chamber of Twitter, for example. So we go on Twitter and we're all from a fairly similar demographic. So within that community, particularly in the health community, we're all much more accepting, more liberal, more open, more left-wing usually. But actually, if you step out of that community and you see what's going on in other communities, sometimes, and this is my personal experience, you can be shocked, by the prejudice that still exists. So you can lull yourself into a completely false sense of security with it. So I think it's important to, step outside that as well and have conversations with different people and different communities, rather than always preaching to the converted, which I think we might do sometimes. Have conversations with people who have similar values to us, and how do we actually have conversations with people who've got very different views, and how do we know they've got different views if they're not openly talking about them, but they might be discriminatory in the way they're behaving, or if they're an employer of a work organisation, and in terms of who they recruit into organisations, or how people are treated, who's promoted, all those kind of things. So yeah, it was just a reflection on that really as you were talking.
Well, I think both of you guys have done teaching sessions for kind of corporations and corporate organisations. Have you got anything you'd like to share back about that experience? You don't have to.
That's interesting.
Sarah, you want to start?
Yeah, I think one of the challenges for teaching and learning is, I think Alfonso knows a lot about this, to create a kind of a supportive space so people can explore their attitudes and beliefs without necessarily being challenged in a particularly unhelpful way. Because I accept now, and although it's kind of difficult sometimes, that people might want to ask me questions, and they're not coming from a bad place, they're just genuinely curious because they might not ever have met one of those before. And so it's about giving people the space to be able to have those conversations. Because then, you know, if people work out some of their attitudes and some of their kind of misconceptions or prejudices in the classroom, we might be equipping them to give better care and support on the front line, because they might not suddenly come across an older gay couple who, you know, are very shocking to them because they've never worked that out in a different environment.
Yeah. Alfonso?
Yeah, I very much agree that it needs to be a very safe space also for people to say actually what they think, because that's the only way that they can actually say their views, and we can then unpack them a little bit, those views. I did the research, but if we go back to the corporate environment, I did the research a few years ago looking at coming out in the workplace. And I found that LGBT people who wish to come out to their colleagues, it's a journey. It's a totally different journey for them, because there is a lot of aggression in the workplace where people don't even realize that they're doing it. Things like banter, for example, comments like who's the man and who's the woman in a same-sex couple. And so there is quite a lot of stigma in the workplace, particularly in some environments. And of course, we know that we have laws to protect. We have the Equality Act. We have the workplace policies. But unfortunately, those policies are there, but they're not always enforced in a way. They're not very much visible in the way that we would hope that they are. So there is a lot in terms of coming out in the workplace. And it's very much of a choice of the person whether or not to come out. And the training I do, and I did some training with Sarah as well, we talk about inclusive language, we talk about the history of mental health, we talk about how the employer can be a better ally, a better inclusive environment for LGBT people, because LGBT people in particular are even scared that if they do say that they're gay, maybe they're going to lose their job, maybe they're going to be prevented from things like promotions and so on. So it's very important that the employer and the corporate environments need to come together and create those inclusive environment for LGBT people as well.
Can either one of you clarify what you mean by microaggressions for maybe people that haven't heard that term before?
So microaggression, I'll try to explain it as best as I can, and maybe Sarah can add on to it, is when there is things like the derogative comments, which is, it's a very subtle form of aggression. It's not, in a way, it's not physical, but it's like those banter, those jokes, comments. As I said before, even comments like in the workplace, some of my participants reported things like, "Oh, there is no real men in this workplace." So it's comments like this that we call microaggression. Is jokes and banters. I don't know if Sarah wants to add anything. Or
well, just pick up on what you were saying earlier on, that you and your partner, sometimes people mistake you for siblings or say, "Oh, is that your brother?" Now, I've had that in the past until my partner changed the colour of her hair. Now, no problem. Not are you sisters, are you twins? But I found that to be a microaggression in some sense, and it gets so sort of tiring as well. And also, you know, the idea of visibility, you just think, oh God, do I have to be clear about this person that this is my partner, not my sister? And you just kind of give up sometimes. But yeah, I think that I agree that we do have to deal with these sometimes subtle, sometimes overt microaggressions, which just weigh you down, as well as the bigger stuff.
I suppose it's like we're talking about that kind of white privilege again, isn't it? If you belong to a dominant group, you slide through life. And dominant and microaggressions are just constantly being caught, constant paper cuts, and it sounds exhausting. Yeah. And one thing I would say about the kind of teaching, you know, is I think it can be an issue when people from certain groups are called to educate everybody else about themselves.
Yes.
I don't think that's terribly fair. And I think everybody who's involved in sort of teaching and learning should be actually pulling their weight on this and role modelling support and acceptance and just plain manners. If you can't be decent, please just be polite, because we've got really clear guidance in our NMC Code of Conduct. These things are not acceptable. And I think one of the things that I first found distressing when I was teaching was every single year, I can't get through an academic year without somebody at some point saying something like, am I able to say that I don't want to work with gay people? Or can I, you know, and it's kind of like conscientious objection. You're like, no, that's not a thing. It's not a thing. And I find that, because you forget, and all of a sudden it draws you up short that someone would think or say that, and be so naive that they think after you've already taught them the Equalities Act, after you've already talked about the importance of professional behaviour, that that's still something that could be genuinely a question that you would want to ask publicly in a classroom. You know, just such a level of naivety. I think one of the weirdest things that ever happened to me, I was teaching in practice areas with a colleague who was married to a woman, a female who was married to a woman, and somebody said to her in the teaching session, "What do lesbians do?" And she said, completely forgetting that the level of, I would say even innocence here, she said, "Oh, you know, well, we love shopping, we go horse riding." And I was like, oh no, that's not what she's asking. We just had this really awkward moment where her understanding of like what it means to be her is here, and this other person is looking at her like she's an alien parachuted in from another planet. And you sometimes have to, I think if you are teaching this stuff, you have to get to a place where you are emotionally okay to deal with naivety as well as cruelty, because they can often hit people at the same level, and it's not like teaching blood pressure. I'll just say that, you know, you don't end up having to deal with the same kind of harms, I think. And I think for anyone who's thinking, oh yeah, absolutely, I want to do inclusivity teaching, I want to do all that stuff, I think it's really important just to mention that, particularly if you're working with somebody who identifies as LGBTQ+. It's important to be sensitive.
It can also be a very rewarding experience, so I have to say. I had a little bit of both, but over the past 8 years that I've been teaching, after teaching my LGBT classes, for example, or inclusivity, I did have a few students coming up to me very recently, one of them from a different country where being gay is illegal. And they came and talked to me and said, I'm gay, but I don't know how to tell my parents. But he was telling me how this helped him and how he's going to try at least now. So it can be a very rewarding experience as well, sharing your own experience of the teaching and your personal experience into the teaching. And it can help LGBT students in particular as well. Absolutely.
Absolutely. I think Vanessa has a question for us.
Yeah, and it links to some of the things we've talked about, really. And that's a question asking for any top tips for nurses that face having to care for people that are discriminating against LGBTIQ plus people. So any top tips about supporting people in your practice who might be discriminatory?
Well, I'll hand over to you guys then.
It's complex.
Anybody?
Well, I suppose like Nicky was saying, people who work in health and social care are working in services that are under the Equalities Act. People have protected characteristics, and there are particular professional frameworks and codes of conduct that people need to abide by, and one of those will be non-discriminatory and anti-oppressive practice towards LGBT people. And without wanting to be combative, you probably have a useful conversation with individuals about, well, we kind of work within these values, and you know, these are the frameworks that our practice should operate within, and having sort of maybe a reflective conversation about, well, why do we have these values? Why do we have these codes of conduct? What's the consequence for the person on the receiving end if you're not very nice to them, or if you dismiss them, or if you have particular views about them that they find hurtful or difficult? And I suppose it's about thinking how those codes of conduct relate to the human encounter at the front line. I don't know if that's useful, but having almost taking the conversation out of being emotional into the professional.
Yeah.
So was the question about how do you support people if they're a service user who's homophobic, or how do you deal with staff?
Yeah, but I think it is about service user, but I think
sorry,
useful look at both anyway. they're both important points, aren't they?
I think education takes you so far, doesn't it, in that compassionate listening, but sooner or later, I think there's a really good thing to say for nurses. If you cannot be compassionate to other people, go work somewhere else. And that's really awful, because we need every single nurse, and I would hate to think that a nurse isn't being used to the best of their capability. But at the end of the day, you can't have people hurting each other, and you can't have people in professional roles who frankly disgrace that professional role.
Yeah,
that's not acceptable. I can remember talking to an older adult who was quite homophobic in a nursing home, who had been quite offensive, should we say, to some of the staff. And we ended up by saying, at the end of the day, you pay your taxes, you're a citizen of this country, and you are absolutely welcome to be arrested for you being homophobic if you'd like us to call the police. And that was the end of it. Done, dusted, finished. So I think after that, he was charming. So there's something to be said, I think, for, once you've gone to a certain point, you need to protect people in the workplace. And you shouldn't have to be treated in an environment, you shouldn't have to work in an environment that damages you. We spend all this time teaching people how to lift up boxes and things like that. But how you would leave somebody in a situation where they're being stigmatized and frightened and hurt on any kind of basis, I think is really unacceptable. And I think one of the things about it so pernicious is that it's the shame of it. So if someone is abusive to you because of a characteristic of yourself, the colour of your skin, your sexuality, for some reason the shame doesn't belong with the person who's being dreadful. It can get all over the person who's a victim of that. So if you have to fill in an incident form and say what somebody said to you, or say how it made you feel or what the impact was, it can almost make you feel twice as hurt by it. And then, you get to a point where I think you get a law of diminishing returns. Like, why do I keep filling this in when nothing is happening?
Yeah.
And that, I think, is not just about sort of homophobia or racism. I think it's about all those times when we don't keep our environment safe. You can't expect people to heal and thrive in an environment that's filled with poison. We don't do it for a wound. Why would we do it for an environment? So I do think you get to a point where you have to tell people professionally and politely with a lovely smile where to get off.
I think the most complex sort of situations I've been in is where it's issues around transgender. So, being a manager, it's quite a long time ago now, maybe 10, 15 years ago. So I think things have moved on. But, I did once manage a member of staff who was going through a transition from male to female. And that was a really complex, difficult situation. But we did do lots of work, not just with the staff on the ward, because it was in a ward situation, but also, with the people who were, service users, carers on the ward, other people who worked with the ward as well. And so there was a lot of preparation. However, when the transition happened, despite feeling during the preparation that everybody, kind of understood and was fairly educated and supportive about it, the reality was different, and there was still a lot of prejudice and stigma. And I think, so that was quite a long time ago, but then, more recently working in prisons, transgender, is a very complex issue within prisons, particularly around risk. And I feel, for me, it's something that people don't address because they're scared to address it. There's not always an understanding about whether, if someone's, male transitioning to female in a female prison, sort of how to address the risk. Is there a risk? How to kind of separate the crime from the sort of transgender experience. So I think there's still a lot of work to do in those areas as well.
I think we've wandered into intersectionality in a glorious way. Can any of us sort of nail down what we mean by that? Don't want to have a bash at it. When we're talking about intersectionality, what we're talking about?
Looking at Vanessa.
Yeah.
Nicely done, Alfonso. We're not looking at Vanessa now.
Yeah, so it's obviously from Kimberly Crenshaw, isn't it? And the concept is that if you're a Black woman, your experience isn't going to be the same as all Black women. It's all about the different layers of oppression. So you might be a Black lesbian woman, you might be a Black lesbian working class woman. So it's about all the different layers of oppression. So for me, it became really a really useful concept when I worked in prisons, thinking about the kind of experience that women have in prisons and the experience that men have in prisons, because the prison system is designed more around men than it is women. But then actually looking within a female prison and thinking, well, actually, there's other layers of oppression. So if a woman's a lesbian in a female prison, that brings its own issues. If a woman's Black, and some of the sort of institutional racism around, you know, sentencing of Black women, and you know, maybe, you know, whether a woman's sort of cultural needs are met in prison. So it's, yeah, so for me, that's what it's about. It's looking at all the different layers of oppression that make up a person's identity. So not just looking at gender or the colour of somebody's skin, but looking at it all and how that might impact on the way a person's treated or the way a person feels or experiences the world. So
not bad. There's a lot of nodding. People seem happy with that. Does anyone want to add to it?
Yeah, please do.
Is there anything?
No, I think that's exactly it. And the way I explain it to students, for example, in a very simple way, is that we are human beings, and as human beings, we are complex. We're not just made of body organs and thoughts processing and so on. We are made of different things, different layers. So I might be white, but I'm also Italian, I'm also gay, I'm also something else, and so on. And all of these layers that make me, they intersect with each other, and they make the person that I am. And also, all of those can have an impact on one another, particularly as well. So how my sexuality can have an impact on the fact that I'm Italian, for example, or the fact that I have an accent, and so on.
I think as well, the only thing I would add to that as well is this idea that if you take it to its extreme, you can almost see it like a game of gigantic snakes and ladders. So if you are paler, you get a point up. If you talk with a working class accent, you take 2 points down. And I think there's to make it even a little bit more complicated, there's this idea as well that you can find strength in a marginalized identity. So being a woman, you know, is not a wholly negative and unpleasant, distressing experience. You know, I have access to a world and a world of experiences which are really empowering and strong, and I wouldn't have if I had a different perspective. So I think as well as something about understanding how the different aspects of our personalities make us up, but also the fact that, you know, at the end of the day, you know, we're talking about a whole month where we're trying to celebrate a certain aspect of people's personality and personhood and self. So I think maybe we're coming around again to kind of some of the kind of strength-based stuff, looking at maybe resistance, looking at maybe some of the things that we can learn from that. So if you think about the Stonewall riot, then one of the first people to heave a brick was a Black transgendered woman. So there's a lot of things going on there in terms of, you know, what it means to understand your identity as a source of strength, as well as maybe something that other people may have their own opinions on. I wonder if we could talk a little bit about that. Yeah. So what could we talk about in terms of resistance? So Sarah, your work has been a lot around sort of sources of resistance as well. And you did work as well on violence and aggression against people with marginalised identities.
That's right. I mean, I think there's something here in what was being said before about a position on the margins. It can be a position of vulnerability, and it can be a position of strength as well. And I think you referring to the Stonewall riots, people were right out on the margins, literally physically, of society. And they'd had enough. They just had enough of being thrown into police vans and taken off for who they were dancing with, what clothes they were wearing. And so, you know, somehow it became a collective act of resistance. I often think of all the people bundled in a police van, thinking we've had enough of this. And then somebody did lob a brick or whatever they did. And so I think that did mark the dawning of a more collective resistance towards all kinds of social oppression and discrimination, which I suppose brings us back to the idea of pride being a mass celebration and crowds of people together. but yeah, I mean, resistance was very important in terms of getting homosexuality as a mental illness out of the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, in 1973. Activists in America and the UK did extraordinary things to get rid of it. You know, they were glitter bombing various psychological, psychiatric conferences. They were tearing down stalls with electric shock instruments on, and this was in the 70s. So yes, collective resistance did end up with the declassification of homosexuality as a mental illness.
But we're still fighting about whether it's appropriate to offer counselling to someone on account of their sexuality, which is mind-blowing when you think we're 2020 and that's still an option. I find that appalling, shocking. I don't know if I can be appalled anymore in 2020. I think it's knocked it out of me. It's been such a year. I'm not sure I still have the capacity to feel shock. I think, Vanessa, you were saying that you've got a comment perhaps from somebody.
Yeah, and we've got a couple of comments. We've got one from the more comments and questions, I would say. We've got one from Kazia Gilders, I hope that's pronounced right, and it's such an important point about the history and legacy of mental health professionals, and that we need to acknowledge that more. So I think just acknowledging our discussion really, because we've talked about that quite a lot, haven't we, this evening. And then the second comment is from Ben Hannigan. And he's really congratulating us on the programme, and also a comment for Sarah, which is saying salutary to hear Sarah say that look still has a part to play in getting help as an LGBT mental health service user. So interesting.
Yeah, it's a shocker, isn't it, when you think about it? You should be able to pay your taxes and walk in anywhere and get the same treatment as anybody else.
It is.
And I think there's something as well about mental health services. If we don't actually really talk about the power issues that exist and have existed, we're never going to move forward. We're never going to get better. We're never going to do better if we don't face up to what's happened and what happens to people sometimes.
And if we don't use our own power in a positive way and acknowledge that we have power, because that's what you hear a lot in mental health. Oh, we don't have any power, you know, but actually we do have power, whether we're people who don't discriminate or, you know, show prejudice and, you know, we work collaboratively, we still have power when we work with mental health. So, and power as individuals, depending on, you know, what we've talked about from an intersectionality perspective. So I think it's also, it's acknowledging that power, isn't it, and using it positively as well. But sometimes when I hear that we haven't got power, that's, you know, I think that's a naive comment really, and it can be quite negative, really, destructive.
I think that kind of takes us around because we're actually nearly at the end of the session. That's gone so fast, as usual. Thank you very much. So we've talked about teaching healthcare, intersectionality, protest, awareness, LGBT equality, people's experiences, mental health services, all sorts of things. So I guess maybe if we think about something to end on, something that would be helpful maybe for practitioners to hear, or helpful for people who are celebrating Pride Month to hear. We'll just finish on like last thoughts from people. Can we go to Sarah?
I think still it's very important for people to think of their own well-being, mental well-being, because LGBT people, although things have changed since the 70s and when the Stonewall riots first kicked off, and thinking about intersectionality, people still have struggles with their sexual orientation and still have kind of experienced distress because of it. And I think we need to recognise that that still goes on. You know, we do have policies that are very positive. We have massive loads of legal reform, which means you can get married and you can adopt children. But there are people living lives where they're still afraid, where they can't come out. And I think because our society's become more diverse and complex, we do have to think about intersectionality. We have to think about people who are same-sex attracted, who are maybe trans, who are coming from not the white majority population. So people from Black and minority ethnic communities, people with different cultures, people who may come as refugees. And I think we need to think about well-being and maybe mental distress well-being in the context of complexity. and of intersectionality, but particularly the complexity and diversity in the LGBT communities.
Absolutely, thank you for that. Alfonso?
Just want to touch on the process of coming out, which we discussed at the very beginning. And by coming out, of course, we mean when a person discloses their sexual identity and sexuality. So we will know that we say that it's a journey to come out. And I like to add that it's a journey that you know when you're ready to start it, but it's a journey that probably will never end for you. So for LGBT people, coming out, it's almost every day. You have to say every day to a new person if you're moving house, if you're meeting new colleagues and so on. So it's something that you keep doing throughout your life. And this can have a very positive or negative impact on the person as well. So in terms of coming out, particularly to those who are not there yet, who are not ready to come out because of their cultural identity, because of other things as well, that they should understand that it is a journey, and when they are ready, it will come natural to them, and it will be evident for them when it's ready for them to come out, or one moment in their life they will have to come out, and eventually they will come out, and then they can be proud and they can help other people as well to come out and share their experiences as well.
I love that, yeah. Vanessa, is there anything you wanted to add?
I think for me, it's just about what I've already covered. It's about being aware of your own privilege and being aware of when you can be an ally as well. Trying to have empathy and understanding what it's like for somebody else, and, standing up against discrimination as well, putting your head above the parapet and actually speaking out about things as well, is really important. So I think, that's my message really. If you, even if, this doesn't affect you, you can help somebody else. So, it's important that we have allies.
I guess for me, just to finish up, what I would say is, if you're a nurse, it is your job to know about people's sexuality and how to support and help people. It is your job to understand terminology, to be respectful. If you make mistakes, to apologise and to learn if you don't know, because not everyone comes out knowing this stuff, and that's absolutely fine. But don't then just sit there a year later saying, I still don't know how to give good service. You wouldn't be out of date with basic life support and then just be like, I still don't know how to save your life. Like, no, don't come with that.
Yeah, exactly.
It's your job to find out if you don't know. Always ask somebody. And I would also say as well, if you're alone in an experience, as Alfonso and Sarah were saying, the experience of being isolated is so devastating to people. And please tell someone, find somebody. People are out there.
Yeah.
And I think it's been really interesting discussion. Thank you very, very much to everybody. Just give the heads up to Dave to say thank you so much, as ever, for lurking sinisterly in the background and managing everything. Really, really appreciated. And we're ready to finish now, Dave. Thank you. You'll count us out.
Thank you.